the U.S. federal budget is on an unsustainable path.
This guy's name is Jerome Powell. He is the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and you've just witnessed him openly admitting to the U.S.'s little debt problem. According to usdebtclock.org, the U.S. is over $35 trillion in debt. And the scariest thing is, the U.S. can't pay the debt back. Or some analysts have even predicted the debt will continue to grow and get worse. But what does this mean for you and me? And is there a way the U.S. can smoothly navigate out of this financial nightmare? Well, the U.S. debt crisis is worse than you think. This is RGM Worldwide. Chapter 1, Understanding the Debt Problem. To understand just how bad the debt crisis is, we need to break down the fundamentals of the U.S. debt situation. Let's start with the basics. Just like you and me, the government has income and expenses.
Can definitely raise taxes and supposedly cut the deficit by $3 trillion, but almost everyone agrees, back with Simpson-Bowles, it should be spending cuts, and if you want to try to figure out a way of increasing revenue. There's no spending cuts that they're talking about now. It's we had pandemic spending, and then we had the same level after the pandemic, which makes no sense.
When the government wants to spend more money than it actually brings in each year, it goes into debt to raise some extra cash. For example, let's say you want to buy a house, but you don't have enough money saved up. You would normally take out a mortgage, right? The government does something similar. When they need more money, they issue what are called government bonds.
You should understand, a bond in the finance world is a debt security in which an authorized issuer owes the holder a debt. Fancy way of saying, I need to borrow money and I agree to pay you back with interest.
So, the government bonds to investors. In return, the government promises to pay them back plus interest at a future date. The length of time before the bond is repaid is called the maturity date. For example, right now the US year Treasury yield is about 4.3%. This means investors get a 4.3% return on their investment every year for the next years. But it's not just you and me buying these bonds. Major businesses in foreign countries are big players too. Japan, China, and the UK are some of the largest holders of US government bonds. This means that if the US were to default on these loans, the ripple effects would be felt across the entire global economy. But how did we end up with $34.8 trillion in debt? It all comes down to deficits. A deficit happens when the government spends more money than it earns in a year. Back in 2001, the US actually ran a surplus, meaning they made more money than they spent. But since then, we've been running annual deficits, which means we're spending more than we're bringing in. And every time there's a deficit, the government has to issue more bonds to cover the shortfall, adding to the national debt. In 2001, the national debt was around $10 trillion. Fast forward 23 years, and it has ballooned to a staggering $34.8 trillion. That's a huge debt load, but the problematic thing is, the US can't pay it down, and honestly, they may not even want to. Because as the debt grows, so does the amount of interest the government has to pay every year. This is where the concept of a debt spiral comes into play. As more debt is issued, more interest needs to be paid, which leads to more debt being issued to cover these payments. And the cycle continues, causing a deficit and bigger problems for us. Chapter 2, the deficit and its implications. So, what's a deficit? It's pretty simple. A deficit happens when the government spends more money than it makes in a year.
The national debt is exploding. We really need growth now. The government is spending so much money that it hurts production, and we're seeing it around the economy. Raising taxes, you said they'd raise $3 trillion. I don't think they would. They always overestimate how much they can do because people respond. When the taxes go up, they produce less of it.
Imagine if you kept spending more than you earned month after month. How would you pay your mortgage or rent? That's exactly what's happening for America. Back in 2001, the US was actually in good shape, running a surplus. A surplus is essentially the opposite of a deficit. In other words, we made more money than we spent. But since then, it's been downhill. We've been running deficits every single year, spending way more than we're bringing in. Where does all this money come from and where does it go? Let's break it down. The government's income mostly comes from taxes, individual income taxes, Social Security and Medicare taxes, and corporate taxes. In the current fiscal year, the US pulled in about $3.29 trillion. We spend the most on Social Security, Medicare, defense, and, you guessed it, interest on our debt. This year, we've spent around $4.5 trillion, leaving us with a deficit of about $1.2 trillion, which means we're short by $1 trillion. One big problem with all this debt is the interest we have to pay on it. And here's the kicker, interest rates are going up. This means the cost of our debt is getting more expensive every year. Just think about it. The interest on our national debt has become one of the largest expenses in the federal budget. So far this year, we've shelled out $601 billion just on interest payments. That's like paying a huge credit card bill that never goes away. And now we're in a dangerous cycle known as the debt spiral. Here's how it works. As we issue more debt to cover our deficits, the interest payments go up. To pay these higher interest costs, we have to issue even more debt. It's a vicious cycle, and it's getting harder and harder to break. But this isn't just a US problem. It has global repercussions. Major countries like Japan, China, and the UK hold a lot of US debt. If we default, it will send shockwaves through the global economy, affecting international trade and financial markets. Chapter 3. Consequences of ignoring the debt crisis. Imagine if you borrowed a toy from a friend but never gave it back. Pretty soon, none of your friends would want to lend you their toys anymore. The same thing happens with countries. If the US can't pay back its debt, other countries might stop trusting us and won't want to lend us money in the future. If the US can't pay back the other countries, these countries lose a lot of money, which can hurt their own economies. This means they have less money for their own projects and needs. Now, if the US can't pay back its debt, it might have to cut back on buying goods from other countries. This means countries that sell a lot to the US, like China, could suffer because they won't have as many buyers for their products. This can lead to job losses and economic slowdowns in those countries and here at home. When businesses see that the economy is unstable, they might stop hiring new workers or even lay off people. This means fewer jobs and more people struggling to find work. Countries like Japan, China, and the UK have lent the US a lot of money. If we can't pay them back, it can cause problems all over the world, not just here. Everyone gets affected. Now you see, ignoring our debt problem isn't just a bad idea, it's a really bad idea. It makes everything more expensive, makes it harder to find jobs, and leaves less money for important stuff we need. It's a problem that affects everyone, everywhere. So we have to face these issues head on. Chapter 4, Fixing the Problem. Fixing the debt problem won't be easy. The key thing is, the government needs to make more money and spend less. One way to make more money is to raise taxes. That means people and businesses pay more money to the government. But guess what? No one likes higher taxes. I know for a fact I won't be happy with paying higher taxes. Where is Donald Trump when you need him?
And on the payroll tax, we'll be terminating the payroll tax after I hopefully get elected.
Another way the government could make more money is by growing the economy. If businesses make more money and people earn more, the government gets more taxes without raising rates. But this takes time and smart planning. On the other hand, the government should spend less. But where do they cut? Social Security, Medicare, and defense are our biggest bills. Which would you cut? Cutting Social Security and Medicare hurts seniors who rely on these programs. Cutting defense could make the country less safe. It's kind of a tough choice. Another way to spend less is to let inflation do the job, which is what's seeming to be the plan on how the government is trying to solve this debt problem. Inflation means prices go up over time. If prices rise, the value of money goes down, so the debt becomes cheaper to pay off.
We in the United States, that the United States government borrows in its own currency. This level of spending isn't a problem because the Fed can just monetize the debt and keep doing so more or less indefinitely. Well, what's your reaction to that talk? Are there risks inherent in it?
Yes, no, as I mentioned in my testimony, the fact that interest rates are lower does mean that we will pay less in interest. It does not mean that we can ignore deficits at all. We're going to have to get on a sustainable path. What does that mean? So the debt is growing faster than the economy.
After World War II, the US did this. By letting inflation rise, the debt got smaller compared to the growing economy. But high inflation can be bad. It makes everything more expensive and can hurt people's savings. The best way might be smart spending and saving. This means the government makes smart choices about what to spend on and how to save money. Investing in things like roads, schools, and technology can help the economy grow. If more people have good jobs and businesses do well, the government gets more money from taxes. Also, fixing how we pay for healthcare and Social Security can help. Making these programs more efficient saves money in the long run. We can learn from other countries too. Take Australia, for example. They have debt, but they managed to save money and even had extra by controlling spending and making smart choices. Australia's government made sure they didn't spend more than they earned. They saved money and invested wisely. The US can do the same with good planning. The US debt crisis affects all of us. It's not just about numbers, it's about our future. We need to make tough choices and think smart to solve this problem. Understanding how the debt works and what can be done helps us all be better informed. But here's the deal. While the government struggles with this crisis, you need to protect yourself. Inflation is on the rise, and the Fed is hiking rates. If you don't know how to navigate this, it could seriously hurt your finances. And there's no better way to learn how to outsmart inflation and invest wisely than by looking at the master himself, Warren Buffett. Did you know he turned just $114 into billions? It's a 7-step strategy you can't afford to miss out on. Don't let rising rates and economic uncertainty catch you off guard. Be proactive, be smart, and keep really getting money worldwide.